Saddam Hussein now has weapons of mass destruction.
Iraq's weapons of mass destruction.
A clear threat to the United States.
There's dozens of ballistic missiles.
It has sponsored and sheltered terrorists.
Paying suicide
Chemical
bombers.
weapons are equally chosen.
Biological weapons, including anthrax and botulism toxins.
Biological and chemical agent to kill millions of people.
Chemical weapons, including VX and sarin, mustard gas.
To a massive and sudden horror.
Massive death and destruction.
Death on a massive scale.
The danger to our country is grave. Delay in decision and inaction could lead to a massive and sudden horror.
It simply makes no sense to wait any longer.
Take action before it's too late.
We will not wait.
As President Bush has said, time is not on our side.
That very first day, on September 12th, one day after September 11, the meeting that was held in the White House, in the Situation Room, led to Rumsfeld asking the question, shouldn't we use this as an opportunity to do something about Iraq as well?
There are al-Qaeda in Iraq.
Saddam Hussein cavorts with terrorists.
Secretly and without fingerprints, he could provide one of his hidden weapons to terrorists or help them develop their own.
Well, the war really had absolutely nothing to do with terrorism. There was no connection whatsoever between Iraq and the secular regime there and the religious fanatics who perpetrated 9/11.
Saddam was not a maniac or a fool. He was a terrible villain, yes, but he was not going to sacrifice his own life and the future of his country to stupid adventures with terrorists who had completely antithetical views to his.
Al-Qaeda has had total contempt for Saddam Hussein himself. He's been a socialist. He's been very harsh. He's treated Islamic leaders, Islamist leaders, extremely harshly.
Iraq, and we have very good intelligence on this, was not part of the picture of terrorism before we invaded. Saddam Hussein and bin Laden were enemies. Bin Laden considered and said that Saddam Hussein was the socialist infidel. These were very different kinds of individuals competing for power in their own way, and Saddam Hussein made very sure that al-Qaeda couldn't function in Iraq, that terrorists couldn't function, except for the small northeastern quadrant of the country where there was an extremist group, but he had no control over that. It was near the Iranian border.
There's no doubt that Ansar al-Islam is a radical Islamic terrorist group with ties to al-Qaeda, but they operate in a part of Iraq that is not controlled by Hussein. The leaders say they seek to overthrow Hussein and his government.
They are our enemy, or really they are also our enemy. We believe that Saddam Hussein, him and his group and his ministers also, they are outside of Islamist zone.
The ties with al-Qaeda was just a scare tactic to exploit the trauma, the very real trauma that the American people have felt ever since 9/11, and to associate that trauma with Iraq. As you know from the polls, most Americans believed that Iraq had something to do with 9/11, and that was a very successful, very deliberate, and very unethical and immoral operation on the part of the PR people of this administration.
Growing danger. He's got weapons of mass destruction. Final proof.
But we don't want the smoking gun
Smoking
to be much
gun.
clout.
Weapons of mass destruction.
Weapons of mass destruction.
Armed
Chemical weapons.
The UK knows develop weapons of mass destruction.
Everyone knows.
Now, I know some will play like they're not real. I'm telling you they're real. As president, I'm responsible for the decision to go into Iraq.
Can the Secretary of Defense, can the Vice President, can this administration take the military to war to feed the greed of contractors?
Private contractors are the second largest force in Iraq. They far outnumber all non-U.S. forces combined.
They outsourced the war to private companies to send people in harm's way to make money.
The Bush administration made up its mind to go to war on September the 11th, 2001. From that time on, you were dealing with rationalization and justification for the war. You weren't dealing with real causes for the war or real reasons for the war. There was never a clear and present danger. There was never an imminent threat.
Weapons of mass destruction.
Weapons of mass destruction.
Weapons of mass death.
Weapons of mass destruction was a convenient way of tricking our Congress into giving the president authority to wage this war.
Saddam has resumed his efforts to acquire nuclear weapons.
develop nuclear weapons.
Nuclear weapons.
Here the intelligence community did a pretty good job. I think for the most part they made it clear that the evidence was not there to show that Iraq was trying to reconstitute its nuclear capability, let alone whether or not it had a nuclear capability, which it didn't.
Leaders will use worst-case assessments that point to nuclear weapons to generate political support because they know people fear nuclear weapons so much.
The intelligence that we were operating off was correct.
The quality of our intelligence operation, I think we're better than anybody else.
We gathered a lot of intelligence. That intelligence was good, sound intelligence.
After the war, we have an internal review within the CIA conducted by a guy named Richard Kerr, who used to be the deputy director of the CIA. A CIA loyalist, enthusiast, and he at this point was telling reporters who bothered to ask that his initial findings were that the intelligence produced by the CIA was based on circumstantial, inferential evidence. They hadn't come up with any hard evidence since 1998 when the inspectors left, and that it always came with caveats and qualifiers.
They call this data mining, going back over old information and coming with new conclusions. The whole purpose of the CIA was to leave those people out of Langley. That's why they're not in Washington. They're in Northern Virginia, away from the White House, away from Congress. Leave them alone, ask them what they think, but don't tell them to rethink their positions, because then you come up with nonsense, like we saw.
There were pretty robust debates among the various people who gathered and assessed information, but that as somehow as it went up higher in the chain of command, finally reaching the White House, that there was a selective use of information to make their case.
I think when you begin to distort the evidence, it leads you into some very dangerous rationale. And I think the administration has not been honest with what its longer-range goals and philosophy were.
I think this particular time, what has been very disturbing to my current colleagues, is the extent of massive intervention by people, particularly from Vice President Cheney's office and Vice President Cheney himself, in the process, and the very heavy leaning on the Director of Central Intelligence and his staff to produce precisely the language, let me say, which would allow them to make the statements which they have been making to support the decision to go into Iraq.
But we now know that Saddam has resumed his efforts to acquire nuclear weapons. Among other sources, we've gotten this from first-hand testimony from defectors, including Saddam's own son-in-law.
His son-in-law's name was Hussein Kamel. It turned out that he also said that at his command, and he was in charge of the biochemical and nuclear weapons programs, at his command, all these things had been destroyed in 1991. And it wasn't really revealed until an enterprising British scholar went and got the debriefing report from Vienna and discovered that Kamel, highly touted Kamel, also said that at his command, and he was in command, they were destroyed.
Why was Hussein Kamel so cavalierly ignored?
So by the late 1990s, let alone 2003, it was clear that Iraq did not have a nuclear weapons program. But over and over again, President Bush, Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, particularly Vice President Cheney, but also National Security Advisor Condi Rice, drummed up the idea of a reconstituted nuclear capability, and particularly the notion that I think has some resonance among the American people of the mushroom cloud.
If someone is waiting for a so-called smoking gun, it's certain that we will have waited too long.
We don't want the smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud.
We cannot wait for the final proof, the smoking gun, that could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
So a lot of people who supported the war in Iraq actually believed that Iraq had the capability to fire missiles that could reach the United States carrying payloads of nuclear or chemical or biological weapons. Iraq has never had the capability to do that. They didn't have it in the first Gulf War. They didn't have it in this war in Iraq. And they don't have it in any way of getting it in the future.
Every year, by law and by custom, we meet here to consider the state of the Union. This year we gather in this chamber deeply aware of decisive days that lie ahead.
Bush presented so many distorted beliefs, estimates, and guesstimates that he appears that he was misleading the public and the Congress.
From 3 Iraqi defectors, we know that Iraq in the late 1990s had several mobile biological weapons labs.
What we were working on before the war was a set of cartoons, of sketches, if you will, of what was said by a defector who probably had his own self-interest at heart and was willing to tell this government whatever he thought would get him the usual $1 million reward and a settlement with new name and a nice house somewhere.
Unfortunately, every reliable source of our own was unable to find anything convincing. So we were dependent on the defectors provided by Mr. Chalabi of the Iraqi National Congress. It's fascinating to see that he has been providing intelligence for many years, and every checkable piece of that intelligence that's come to public notice has proven to be false, or at least self-serving in the extreme.
Intelligence sources tell us that he has attempted to purchase high-strength aluminum tubes suitable for nuclear weapons production.
I think there was very little doubt that the centrifuge tubes, so-called, were nothing but rocket motor tubes to go into M81 style artillery rockets. They certainly have all the specs for that.
Nuclear experts, for instance, from Lawrence Livermore's Laboratories Z Division, the experts on centrifuge enrichment, came out and said, no, you couldn't enrich uranium using these tubes. They're not compatible.
I saw it as a deliberate attempt to take information and selectively take information and try to basically say Iraq poses an imminent nuclear threat and therefore action is absolutely necessary. And I felt that was absolutely wrong.
I'm deeply troubled by what I see as the administration's continued effort to selectively release intelligence information that supports its policy or political agenda, while withholding equally pertinent information that does not do that. The question I am wrestling with is whether the very independence of the U.S. Intelligence Committee has been co-opted, to be quite honest about it, by the strong controlling hand of the White House.
The International Atomic Energy Agency confirmed in the 1990s that Saddam Hussein had an advanced nuclear weapons development program.
The administration showed photos of nuclear or former nuclear weapons sites in Iraq, pre-1991 nuclear weapons sites, claimed that new construction showed they were ongoing nuclear weapons production sites. Complete nonsense.
The most troubling thing about the fact of the distortions and the misleading statements that Bush gave Congress is that it is a federal felony. It's a crime to mislead and distort information and present it to the Congress.
The British government has learned that Saddam Hussein recently sought significant quantities of uranium from Africa.
CIA officials warned members of the president's staff the intelligence was not good enough to make the statement, Iraq tried to buy uranium from Africa.
In October, for the Cincinnati speech, not for the State of the Union, but the Cincinnati speech, George Tenet asked that this be taken out of the Cincinnati speech, the reference to Yellow Cake. It was taken out of the Cincinnati speech because whenever the Director of Central Intelligence wants something out, it's gone.
How to get back in?
People didn't remember.
Just 16 words in the State of the Union address, words that we now know were misleading. And retired career diplomat Joe Wilson tried to warn the administration of just that nearly a year before the speech.
I received a call from the CIA in February 2002, and I was invited out to talk to those people within the broader intelligence community who deal with 3 different subjects: Iraq, uranium, and Niger. I briefed them on what I knew about the uranium business. It was during the course of that briefing that they said that they had received a report that had piqued the interest of the Office of the Vice President, and that report was of a purported memorandum of agreement authorizing the sale of uranium yellow cake, somewhat enriched uranium, from Niger to Iraq, and it was a document that was executed by the government of Niger. They asked me if I would be willing to go out and take another look at it and talk to people I knew there. I'd spent the 8 days there drinking mint tea and talking to everybody there was to talk to who knew anything about the subject matter in Niamey. And I'd come back persuaded that could not have happened. One, from a business perspective, because of the way the consortium was structured, you just couldn't do it without a lot of people knowing. And two, the way the government bureaucracy was structured, you could not make the decision without a lot of people knowing. And if you made the decision would be reflected in a series of signatures on the documents. And if the documents did not contain those signatures, they could not be authentic government of Niger documents.
The president quoted a British paper. We did not know at the time. No one knew at the time in our circles. Maybe someone knew down in the bowels of the agency, but no one in our circles knew that there were doubts and suspicions that this might be a forgery. Of course, it was information that was mistaken.
Now, given what I knew about where the question had originated, and given what I knew about the way the government works, I knew that people in her circle did know.
Based on thorough analysis, the IA has concluded, with the concurrence of outside experts, that these documents, which form the basis for the reports of recent uranium transaction between Iraq and Niger, are in fact not authentic.
Numerous French words were misspelled in the documents. One of the letters was signed by a Niger official who had left office 10 years ago. Several dates in the documents did not match the day of the week. Several of the names and titles of officials mentioned in the documents were incorrect.
We all know that the documentation on Yellow Cake from Niger was fake, but why doesn't anybody say who did it, who faked the document? And why don't we take another look then at the same stream of consciousness that was prevailing at that moment on the aluminum tubes and even the trailers, the bioweapons trailers that were so ballyhooed. At that point, someone's got to say, who is putting this intelligence out there and why? And I don't think that question's been answered, and maybe because the answer is known, and it's not a pleasant one.
Who was it that asked for this review of the Niger nuclear material question? It was the Vice President. Mr. Wilson, former ambassador, was sent to Niger in response to the Vice President's questions about this issue.
The question remains, who did the document? Who forged the document? And why? The list is possibly short. Somebody ought to be able to work on that.
First of all, it should be noted that Colin Powell's speech to the United Nations was theater, a masterful theater, effective theater at the time. Here's a man who has tremendous credibility, who presents himself to the Security Council, to the American people, to the international public, and stares the camera in the eye and says he knows Iraq has weapons of mass destruction.
Leaving Saddam Hussein in possession of weapons of mass destruction for a few more months or years is not an option.
My first visual impression here, watching George Tenet, the head of the Central Intelligence Agency, back there as a prop, almost like a potted plant, as if to say that the Central Intelligence Agency stands behind, or in this case sits behind, everything that Colin Powell says. That was a terrific blow to the morale of the Central Intelligence Agency analysts.
Saddam Hussein has chemical weapons.
Chemical weapons, although they can be very deadly in a subway station or something like this, are not really strategic weapons. They are weapons that can kill 50, 100, 200 people, but in fact they won't devastate you the way a nuclear weapon in New York City or Chicago or someplace would be a deadly blow.
Saddam Hussein has used these horrific weapons on another country and on his own people.
He used weapons Saddam Hussein did back in the 1980s when the U.S. administration, the Reagan administration, was actually supporting him and allowing him to import the chemical precursors for that. Donald Rumsfeld actually is a special envoy for Ronald Reagan back in those years.
Colin Powell spoke of thousands of liters of anthrax that were unaccounted for. And he said they're probably hiding it. And then he held up a little vial. of white powder. And he said, a couple teaspoonfuls of white powder like this, if launched against American cities, could kill thousands of Americans. If he was truly to reflect the Iraqi capability, he would have held up a bottle of Diet Coke and said the Iraqis produced anthrax that looked like this. It has a shelf life of 3 years. The last known production batch came out in 1991, so even if Iraq was hiding this brown sludge liquid, it would be useless today.
Just a few weeks ago, we intercepted communications between two commanders in Iraq's 2nd Republican Guard Corps.
If you know anything about Iraq, they have very strict communication security procedures. So you would never have military personnel speaking in the clear over a radio about sensitive subjects.
On the left is a close-up of one of the 4 chemical bunkers.
There were never any chemical weapons in that facility. I'm intimately familiar with that facility. I've inspected it a number of times. Other inspectors have inspected it many more times than I have.
To believe they were proof is to believe the statement that Iraq would put its crown jewels in the one building or one of the few buildings that either the United States will bomb first or the inspectors will go to first.
I would have to comment here on Secretary of State Colin Powell's debut as an imagery analyst. It was highly embarrassing for those of us who know something about the business. We couldn't tell whether this was an honest mistake by those who now do the imagery analysis, who now report to the Secretary of Defense, unlike our day when they reported to the Central Intelligence Agency. Whether that was the case or whether perhaps Colin Powell was being set up.
We have first-hand descriptions of biological weapons factories on wheels and on rails.
These mobile labs have now been shown to be nothing more than hydrogen generation facilities.
Here you see both truck and rail car mounted mobile factories.
When you take a look at the mobile labs that Colin Powell discussed, he didn't put up photographs of these facilities. He put up artist renditions of these facilities. Why? Because we have no proof they exist.
This video of an Iraqi test flight obtained by UNSCOM some years ago shows an Iraqi F-1 Mirage jet aircraft. Note the spray coming from beneath the Mirage. That is 2,000 liters of simulated anthrax. Iraqis continue to visit bin Laden in his new home in Afghanistan.
George Tenet's analysts had spent a year and a half of torturous investigation, torturous analysis, to see if there were ties between Al-Qaeda and Iraq. They found none.
Our conservative estimate is that Iraq today has a stockpile of between 100 and 500 tons of chemical weapons agent.
So the Secretary of State is telling us that our conservative estimate is that Iraq possesses between 100 and 500 tons of chemical weapons agent, enough to fill 16,000 warheads on the battlefield. Where are they? What happened to them?
Iraqi denials of supporting terrorism take their place alongside the other Iraqi denials of weapons of mass destruction. It is all a web of lies.
It was a masterful performance, but none of it was true. Where are all these weapons? Where is all this VX? Where is all the anthrax?
The reality is that between the original UNSCOM inspections and the UNMOVIC inspections, you destroyed, with those inspections, 90 to probably 95% of the Iraqi arsenal. The first Gulf War destroyed almost nothing. And, post-war U.S. battle damage assessments confirm that.
By 1998 at the latest, those inspectors had discovered most of the weapons of mass destruction, and the Iraqi programs at that point were essentially at an end.
The inspection regime worked. It was the most intrusive inspection regime in history, and it worked. And at the end of the day, that's another reason why we went to war for nothing.
Mr. President, I'm responsible for the decision to go into Iraq.
The president and many of his senior officials defrauded the American public. And the conclusion about what you have to do about it is so clear that people don't even want to hear the underlying facts.